Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is David Zsutty, and David is an attorney at law and the executive director of the Homeland Institute, and he's going to tell us more about the Homeland Institute. So, David, how are you doing?
Hi, Mr. Matthews. I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm great, David. David, I love research and policy analysis. So, what is the Homeland Institute?
Well, So the Homeland Institute is going to explore basically the negative effects of globalization and multiculturalism, and also try to find workable and humane alternatives. That's on our website's page if you would like to check it out. But basically, these ideas are taken as objective goods that can never be, questioned. And we do question them. We think there can be too much of a good thing, and these may not be good things at all to begin with. And we're going to mostly explore this by conducting polls. Our first poll should be dropping very, very soon, but we will also be writing articles, exploring other topics. And one thing we are working on is proposing model legislation. We, of course, cannot back or oppose any particular law. However, we could explore in a theoretical sense what a model law code would look like. For example, for how to conduct elections, also how to deal with employee rights in light of mass doxing. So those are things we're looking at doing going forward.
Great. So, David, in America, some people on the right refer to themselves as dissidents. However, David, not all dissidents oppose globalization, especially dissidents who are in the old right tradition. So one dissident European thinker, quite influential during his lifetime, but no longer alive, was in favor of free trade and free markets, but at the same time, he opposed multiculturalism. So, David, could you explain the objections to globalization? Why is too much globalization negative? And my own position is that free trade is good, globalization is good, and outsourcing has positive effects. But please do tell us, what are the objections to globalization?
All right, so there's two realms which I object to globalization. First, economic. Second, and probably more important, is cultural. So right now with globalization, we have very, very complicated supply chains, and that has done a lot to promote the growth of goods and services. The green line has gone up. However, these are also very, very fragile. For example, and we're seeing that, for example, during COVID, there were a bunch of cargo ships outside the port of Los Angeles, which I could actually see sometimes just sitting there. And this led to shortages, and it wasn't anything like the Soviet Union, but it was pretty bad how capitalism and globalism promised mass consumer goods, but we didn't get that at all. And going forward, that was simply due to COVID, which is something of a black swan event, even though there are rumblings of a new variant or making hysteria out of a new variant, which might bring these restrictions back. But there's other things that can happen, such as war and terrorism. For example, if Iran were to shut down the Straits of Hormuz, that would affect the global economy because we're all integrated. That would cause chaos. There was economic chaos caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And most importantly, there's now saber rattling about Taiwan. China controls our debt. They also might attack Taiwan, which produces electronics chips. And they can also shut down the South China Sea simply by using hypersonic cruise missiles. Trade is good in that it can enrich you. People can both sides can win from it, but they both become overly dependent. And my personal objection about the economic aspect of globalism is that I personally think that some free trade can be good. I don't believe in complete autarky or an extreme version of autarky. For example, North Korea has something called juche, which roughly translates as self-reliance. Well, they're also a hermit kingdom. They take what is a good idea and take it to a very strange, unhealthy extreme. I'm very much like in the vein of Aristotle, where I think there's a golden mean. And there can be too much diversity. There can be too much globalization, also too much autarky. I think you can have some free trade without becoming fully dependent upon foreign powers as we have, or deindustrializing. Right now, it's not just a problem. First of all, it's a problem of our jobs going overseas. It's also a problem of our expertise going overseas. There's a constant complaining about we can't find skilled labor. And if you look, people oftentimes laud Ronald Reagan for opening up the door to trade with China. That kind of backfired. That seemed like a good idea at the time. It has completely backfired. China is a rising power that threatens America and a lot of other countries now. So I think globalization, it's a continuum of how open or closed you want to be. And I think there is a sweet spot, but that sweet spot tends a lot more towards autarky than free trade. But turning towards the cultural aspect, at some point, it's great to have tourism, even foreign exchange students, as long as they aren't stealing secrets like China does. But the problem here is that, again, this can become too much of a good thing where all of a sudden everyone's moving to other countries. Usually it's from non-white countries to white countries, which is bad because, first of all, that deprives non-white countries of smart people that they need back home. And then this causes cutthroat competition within white countries. It also changes the culture. And my whole thing is that each country's culture is fine how it is. Why are we trying to mix everything up? I think, and I was a lawyer, and if you want to change something, the burden is on you to prove it. Like you have emotion, you have to present proof. Burden's on you. Changing other societies should be that burden to prove that is a good thing is upon the proponent of it. But it's taken for granted that this is a good thing. We should all become mixed up. And two, at some point, you have this problem kind of described by Spengler of creating these rolled cities that become completely deracinated, decultured. It's everywhere and everywhere. Like, is Los Angeles that different from New York? At some point, will Dubai become that indistinguishable? What about, Beijing? At some point, these rolled cities become not, a kaleidoscope of color, but just gray. There's no differentiation. That destroys culture. I would rather see different cultures for all countries, all races be vibrant and distinct. And globalization, when taken to an extreme, inherently undercuts that.
David, the greater the exposure to Western institutions and culture, the richer the country. Many countries have benefited from Western human capital and technologies. You argue that cultural diversity is positive. You would prefer a world in which different countries have different cultures. That's not a problematic view. But the reality is that non-Westerners are immigrating to Western countries because of their cultures and institutions. Institutions are shaped by culture and human capital, and it's difficult to change culture. So, although I agree with your notion that people have the right to cultural autonomy, all cultures are not equal. And if other cultures are so distinct from the West to the point where they are regressive, then people from non-Western countries are going to relocate to Western countries. I think that individuals in the West ought to globalize Western cultures and institutions because the reality is that outside of outside of Eastern Asia, North America, and Western Europe, most places are not a paradise, and people are not running from Germany to Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia and Dubai are rich countries. They're running from the Middle East and even rich countries, relatively rich countries like China to the United States. So rich Chinese people are migrating to America. Therefore, again, as I said, I'm not undercutting your argument that cultural autonomy is not important, but don't you believe that institutions like the Homeland Institute should promote the globalization of Western culture?
I would disagree for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a very pragmatic question here before we can get to moral questions, which is how would we go about spreading Western culture to non-Western countries? One would be persuasion, and that is simply going to be extremely, extremely difficult. I know you said a lot of people are coming or want to immigrate to the West because of our institutions and
Exactly.
culture, but I would push back on that because isn't most immigration driven by economics rather than a desire to partake of our culture and institutions. I do get that there are some people, say in Saudi Arabia, who might want to live in a country that doesn't treat women as poorly as Saudi Arabia does. That is true. However, a lot of immigrants are economic immigrants, and there is some proof of this. I don't have the stats in front of me, but there is actually re-immigration when the economy went down, I believe in either America or Germany. And a lot of immigrants do come here because they want, economic reasons, a better life. There's better employment here. The economy is not looking too good right now for anybody, but that has traditionally what has driven immigration. For example, a lot of illegal immigration in California, it was seasonal. There'd be seasonal migrants who would come across without documentation or papers or proper channels. They would make money, send the money back home, then leave. And they would not learn the language. They would not assimilate to the culture. Their kids might, but it's always haphazard, and there's still a very strong, Mexican identity with Aztlan and all that. And sometimes there can be a positive cultural pride that's just positive, like I like me, I like who I am. Sometimes it's also a little, I don't like you. It's more negative. And you see that definitely with the Aztlan movement. A huge problem in America is that recently non-white immigrants have not assimilated.
Yes,
There's
yes,
also in Europe, you have people, it's not this that they're continuing to be Muslim, which should be one thing. It's that they have very little desire to assimilate at all into, say, German or French culture. We saw, for example, in French, these horrible riots. I mean, there is a joke that they are assimilating into French culture, given the French love of political chaos and drama. But they're taking it their way they're practicing writing is a lot more violent and extreme and brutal than the French version of just, complaining about taxes or work hours or whatever. It's a lot more hostile. And there's a very strong undertone of anti-white hatred in these French riots. I would say that it's a lot of immigration. Some of them do want to partake of our culture. Like there are people who fled from Vietnam in the olden days during the Vietnam War who wanted freedom, but a lot of it just comes down to economic reasons. And at some point that hurts our native born. It also deprives, non-white countries of their talent. This is a brain drain at some point, and it's hurting other countries from developing. Going to that too, like the whole persuasion thing, how we can do this if we did want to, and I don't want to, we have persuasion where we have force. Persuasion probably isn't going to work because we have these entrenched cultural values. And I believe culture isn't just this floofy thing that you get from a founding document or it's a fad. It comes from blood. It's really an instinct felt in your blood. Or you have centuries of laid up culture. Iraq has been Muslim for centuries. There's tribal customs before that in Afghanistan that got blended with Islam. I think it's both immoral, but it's also just highly impractical to impose Western ideas upon other countries if they don't want them. If you look, we try to basically bomb democracy. And by democracy, we mean like human rights, third wave feminism, et cetera, into Iraq and Afghanistan. That has horribly backfired. It has backfired spectacularly. And all we did was cause resentment there. I don't think you can bomb free markets, equality, human rights into people that will make them resent you. It's also not very democratic when you think about it. So the argument for democracy gets defeated as soon as you start shooting and bombing people. I mean, it took 20 years to try to change the Middle East, and it was a spectacular failure. Bush's mission accomplished banner was one of the biggest self-owns ever in the history of America.
immigrants are attracted by welfare. It's called the magnet thesis. Over culture shapes economics. Individualistic countries are not only more innovative, they have better governance standards. Long-term orientation predicts entrepreneurship and saving. People also flee their respective countries to escape nepotism and corruption. There is a presumption that the West is not as corrupt as other places. The West actually spearheaded the anti-corruption initiative. Western institutions have traditionally been more impartial than elsewhere. So these are the cultural argument explaining why people would relocate from somewhere in Africa to America or England. Again, I don't disagree with your response, and neither do I have an issue with cross-country income gaps. But the reality, David, is that most people, given the opportunity, would prefer to live in the States than even Singapore. So Singapore has exceptionally high living standards. It has the best public sector in the world, but Singapore is not as free as America. So there are often trade-offs, and again, people vote with their feet. So I do appreciate what you're saying, but as a student of Western history and somebody who admires Western civilization, it really becomes irritating when people discuss cross-country income gaps or poverty in the third world. Because basically you're saying people have a right to cultural autonomy, and they do, but what those people who affirm the right to cultural autonomy should also reconcile economic failure with cultural nihilism. A lot
I
you may go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff I want to address there. First, I'm going to start with the cultural nihilism. I think saying that each culture has its own place, they're all special, isn't the same as cultural nihilism. Nihilism is a very negative word for
Yeah,
me
that
because what
word
we
was
see in the
deliberate.
West is
Hello,
yes,
David. That word is deliberate because I'm from a non-Western country, so I know why I'm using that term. So
yes.
in some parts of the non-Western world, there's this pathetic obsession with local culture to the point where it becomes pointless.
I understand, but I think just saying like I feel like nihilism simply says it doesn't care. At that point, it almost feel like let's throw away all the cultures are all the same. Or, it doesn't matter if China is Chinese or if it becomes French or France becomes African or Africa becomes French. Nihilism is also for me a very deep-rooted thing that kind of works hand in hand with Marxism, where and also like these weird French existentialists where basically at that point there are no values. Instead of saying that, respecting that different peoples might have different values, it's there's no values at all. That's a very different thing from valuing differences in values. But another thing here is about the magnet thesis. I'm going to really push back on that because I've read a while. One of the most influential books I've ever read was Ann Coulter's Adios America, and this was quite some time ago. But a lot of immigration is ultimately economic, and in regards to the desire to have Western institutions, I do believe that building good institutions has to be done bottom up by their own people. For example, how did the West get these institutions? These were painstakingly created through trial and error over centuries. Like
Yes.
nobody came down and gave it to us. Like we had to, like one of the things I raised from reading Carl Schmitt is that a lot of Western thought has been an overreaction to the bloodthirsty wars of religion, where they basically decided we need to drop fighting over Catholic versus Protestant because we're all dead now. That was we learned the hard way that having or mixing religion and politics where we go to war because someone is a slightly different religious sect of you is probably a bad idea. That had to be learned firsthand, and somebody could have told us duh, that's stupid, but we would still probably have needed to learn about it the hard way. And two, I am a race realist. I do believe that there are differences in IQ. Also, when IQ is about the same, there's still preferences for different flavors of how things should be done. For example, Japan is, you could say they're westernized. I'd say that they're modern, they're industrialized, but they aren't really European or Western, even though they really like European culture. They're still their own thing. They came about this stuff in a very Japanese manner. And you see this in artwork, all that. I hate to say anime, but it's true. They're just a different people and they develop their own institutions in their own time and their own manner.
The
And
Japanese copied the West to get rich. So Japanese
yes,
culture has remained Japanese, but the Japanese are pragmatic people. That's why it was easier for the Japanese to modernize than the Chinese.
yes. And here's the thing, that the Japanese didn't need to come to America to do that. I mean, first of all, they did kind of have certain constitutions, constitutional ideas thrust upon them at bayonet point after we bombed to their cities, but a lot of this was voluntary. At some point, there's the old saying, you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. So we can try to, enforce Western values on people, but they need to want it. And if they want it, they won't need to come. For example, we basically copy and pasted the American Constitution onto Liberia. Liberia is not prosperous. A lot of this
No,
comes down to cultural issues and also racial issues and the perennial IQ issue. I wish them the best of luck, but obviously there is no such thing as a magic paper. A
not
lot
at
of this
all.
has Right, it's not going to work. We can't simply Your mileage will vary. I think the American Constitution, the original one from 1789, was very good, but different people will have different experiences with it, and some of them might actually be better off under a different constitutional order. For example, a lot of African countries might prefer something that's more tribal. A lot of Muslim countries are going to be more theocratic. I can't change that. I don't want to change it. I think trying to change it would be a disaster. There has to be voluntude here. And there is a problem here where immigrants come here, they learn about American culture. Some of them do love it. There's a problem where it seems there's a lot more who kind of despise it. A lot of, for example, amongst Indians, others, they come here and they either see whitey as weak, or they resent it, or they naturally resent having to grow up in a different country. And second and third generation children of immigrants are sometimes, if they go to college and they start being exposed to anti-white ideas like critical race theory, they become very vicious. They don't want to learn about our culture or institutions and then get along, follow our lead and live in a white society, or go back home and teach their people about it. They come to resent it. And that is bad. That this inherently backfires. And two, there's no other really unique thing lingering behind all this, which is, why do we have a duty at all to teach other people? All things being equal, it'd be nice if everyone, had a nicer country. But at some point, when we are struggling right now with Bidenomics, a bunch of issues at home, cultural issues, economic issues, it's kind of like a white man's burden where we have to basically go out and teach the whole world how to be Western, even though they resent us for it. It's this weird self-immolation thing, and it's, nobody else feels like they have to do this. Like the Chinese have a very advanced ancient culture. They don't feel a need to basically impose Chinese ideas upon everybody. There might have been an exception in regards to maybe communism, but that wasn't even Chinese culture. That was like,
Western.
Maoism, even though it was a Chinese take on communism, well, communism is still ultimately Western. So the exception proves the rule there. So at some point, I'm asking white people to have foreigners in the country who do not like them pay money, have their culture changed to go on this massive world building project from people who are not going to like them, are not going to learn, are going to resent them for it. I'm happy to have a cross-cultural dialogue with anybody, but there needs to be mutual respect. I think for mutual respect, there needs to be some distance sometimes. I would even say oftentimes.
What
China, Japan and America get along great, but we're not, and we don't have mass immigration one way or the other.
the liberalization of the curriculum is a destructive trend. It's imprudent to expect Americans not to emphasize American history or the wider history of Greek, Roman, and other Western civilizations. No, and I've often repeated it on this show. We're not forcing the Chinese to stop teaching Confucian, but so many have a problem with John Locke, even Adam Smith. Karl Marx is obviously problematic for various reasons, but there's this assault on dead white men. But nobody's going to Japan and telling the Japanese to stop teaching their philosophy. They're not doing that in Iran or Iraq. It's only taking place in the West, and that's really pitiful.
It is, and I think that is a dangerous thing. In fact, I would say that, recently they don't emphasize our Greco-Roman heritage. Whenever they talk about US history, it's always in a negative light.
Quick,
And
David,
the
David,
point
David, I have to make a quick point. Do you know what's really hilarious? Whenever these professors or pundits our teachers discuss American or Western history, it is never comparative. So they say American colonies, the British had colonies, but they never say, okay, let's talk about the Persian Empire or the Aztec Empire and compare to the American Empire. That's never done.
I agree. I am very much a fan of ancient history and comparative politics. I do agree that there needs that the American curriculum needs to be expanded, and one of the problems here is also it's kind of a Nietzschean term. It's slave morality. It's victim culture. Everyone wants to be a victim. Everyone wants to say that America is a bully because that's how you get your way here. You know, history is rough. It's violent. It's brutal, and I've always preferred to look at history kind of in a new. I have my own moral opinions, but I generally tend to basically back off and try to be as objective as possible, not, clutch my pearls on the Mongols or the Aztecs because they're bloodthirsty. At some point, I'm obviously opposed to human sacrifice or, killing everybody in Baghdad, but at some point, this is simply how history has mostly been. I think Western liberals have forgotten just how rough and tumble history can be. And if you are conquered, which a lot of white countries are being conquered right now through mass immigration and subversion of the legal systems, being conquered isn't fun. People don't say thank you for handing over your empire. They tend to enslave, kill, and exploit you. It was not fun to be conquered at any point in time. It really wasn't. And this is simply par for the course. And two, I think a lot of this is intentional. They do want to foster this victimhood mentality where it's all about how many victim points you have. And you bring up a good point that comparatively, this isn't a unique thing. In fact, the North African slave trade far eclipsed European slave trade. There was Arab slave traders. There were atrocities in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans were resented because they enslaved other Greeks. It's not something I like, but it's simply a fact of
It's
life
just
for most of
reality,
history.
and comparative analysis will inform students that on average, Western imperialism was under a different governance framework that endures higher moral standards. It's just like the Berlin, the spirit of Berlin, or dismissing corrupt officials in German, British, and French colonies. So people like to attack colonialism and say, oh, colonialism was so brutal. But they never say, under British, German, and French colonialism, corrupt officials were actually charged and expelled. That's never stated.
I agree. I would say that colonialism kind of needs to be revised due to both the kind of Western system of trying to be fair. I mean, these empires were set up to extract resources. I'm not going to try to whitewash that, but there was a upside to this was that they brought infrastructure to places that didn't have infrastructure. This was the upside of the white man's burden, for better or for worse, for all sides involved. And two, one of the things I want to emphasize are the options. So let's say if the British didn't rule India, well, they were ruled by the Mughal Empire.
Exactly. I see that all the time.
Yeah, and same with the Spanish conquering, well, Mexico, where they were ruled by the Aztecs, who weren't particularly nice overlords to their
Yeah.
empire.
And
So
more studies are showing that there's a strong correlation between pre-colonial institutions and contemporary development. So academics are actually arguing that pre-colonial institutions in the Americas and Africa are shaping development. The argument is not that they have shaped development, but they are continuing to shape it. And sometimes they're doing so in a negative sense.
I agree. I think there is a lingering pre-colonial culture in most places because culture is fundamentally derived from blood. So you take away these Western institutions being rolled over, they're going to revert to whatever was kind of like the default position. And you mentioned that a lot of people prefer Western government because of the lack of corruption, but the sad fact is that corruption, anti-corruption sentiment is very unique to Northwestern Europe. In fact, for example, in ancient Rome, the way that they did taxes, it was full on corruption. You had people, this is why tax collectors were spoken of so horribly. It wasn't just because people disliked taxes, it's because the tax collectors were basically bully tyrants and entirely corrupt. And this was an empire that we laud. It at some point, even Eastern Europe during the Soviet era and even before, after the Soviet, it was simply, you have to grease some hands. And it seems like corruption across most societies is the norm and not the exception. And it seems to simply be a natural way of things where things are less institutional and abstract and more personal. Like if you want your paperwork handled quickly in, a country in Latin America, you might want to give some money to the person doing it as a tip. And for them, they don't see this as it's the way their blood speaks. They don't see this as being that much different than we see tipping a waiter at a restaurant to make sure you get good service. Is this efficient? No. Is it how they naturally want to do things? Yes.
You're
What
right.
does it take to change this? I don't know, but it's probably a lot.
I mean, I'm from Jamaica. Jamaica has a weak civic culture. It's really corrupt, and we observe corruption in even minute events. So, for example, somebody is on his job. No, let me give an even better example. In Jamaica, the government owns public spaces, and the one can park in public spaces because they're maintained by tax dollars. But there are these hoodlums who will show up and they basically extract resources from you to secure your car, even though you didn't ask them. And that's corruption. They're basically bandits. And people think it's okay. You go somewhere, the security guard is working, he's doing his job, but yet he's asking you for money. And it's just part of living in a corrupt country. So people often think that the problem with Jamaica is that the government is corrupt. No, the culture is reinforcing corruption. That's the problem.
I agree. And I have to ask, this does sound very bad. This does not sound like a pleasant way to live life.
No, it's not.
But my question then is, what can or should we do about it? For example, what would it take to change this? And I think if any change is going to come with this, it will have to come from the Jamaican people with their own local leaders who can speak to the people in their language.
I live in Jamaica, David, and do you know what I want to do? I want to migrate.
I don't blame you.
No, I'm not stupid. Expecting some countries to really develop is really unfortunate. They just don't have that potential. In the realm of economics, I'm a realist, and some countries are going nowhere. Sorry.
Right. That's true. And I do think we need to have some brutal honesty about this, where can Jamaica be changed? And I understand you don't want to live this way, but at some point, there are things about white people that sometimes annoy me, even though I am a white person. And, I couldn't just, I think it'd be wrong for me to basically say, well, Japan has a moral duty to let me come in there because I prefer the way Japanese do stuff. I really like their teriyaki. I really like sushi and the way they do things and the respect for elders. And their bus stations are a lot cleaner and more orderly than American ones. Well, Japan has a right to tell me no. I could not morally hold them in censure for that. And two, what I want to focus on is what could we positively do? Say if Westerners wanted to change Jamaica for the Jamaicans, what would be the price tag for them? What could we do? I obviously pocket constitutions aren't going to fix this.
Look,
What should we do? At some point, what concrete solution is there and what's the price tag on it?
the price tag is like Fukuzawa Yukichi, who is one of the architects of modern Japan. So Fukuzawa Yukichi, maybe you are familiar with the story. He was not afraid to tell the Japanese people that they were backward. Countries cannot change without an acknowledgement of failure, and Jamaicans are really sentimental and emotional. The only way you can get Jamaicans to change is basically to say, this is a shithole place and you need to change. And they're not going to respond kindly to that. So no, I don't see it changing. Yeah, that's one of the it's not easy, it's actually quite difficult, but countries cannot evolve without acknowledging failure. That's impossible.
I completely agree with that. I do want to piggyback off of it. For a country to change, they do have to acknowledge failure. And it'll be easier for them to acknowledge failure if it's one of their own countrymen explaining that to them than a foreigner like myself.
No, when I used to contribute to local publications, I ensured that my articles were as palatable as possible, and the responses weren't particularly good. So these people are incorrigible. They are not going to change.
Yeah. It's a difficult world and a difficult problem.
Yeah,
I wish you the best of luck, and I wish Jamaica the best of luck. But at
what?
some point,
No,
if
no,
you are having luck, I think we'd have even less, and it'd be at an even higher price. I think they see me, what's this crazy white American with a strange last name trying to boss us around and call us failures? Or if you got, I think we would have even less success. But
no,
and if that
no.
means
There's a
Jamaica can't
preference
develop,
for because of the history of colonialism and colorism. There is still a preference for the expert of white people. So maybe they are going to take you seriously. Who knows? But I'm not interested. I've migrated mentally from that place, and I did so a long time ago.
interesting.
Yeah, I really don't care.
Yes.
So people,
Yeah.
when I write, people often assume that I'm a Black American or some foreigner, maybe an African. But I migrated from Jamaica mentally years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I try to be patient, but I'm sorry, and this is why I keep telling dissidents that the globalization of Western culture isn't always bad, because on the ground living in a backward non-Western place is not pretty. It isn't. Like I started this program by saying the greater the exposure to Western institutions and culture through the country, and this is actually a factual statement. So we all like to say, oh, all cultures are good. They all have some unique value. But where do we want to live? Not in Nigeria.
Right. That is a good point. I think there is part of that, but at the same point, from the Western perspective, if people who want to, at some point, we also have to take our own side here. So if we have, I think on maybe on outreach to non-white countries that doesn't involve great cost or expense or danger on our behalf, like simply having a cross dialogue, that'd be great. If they want, you can keep your culture without getting rid of corruption. I don't think, that's something that could be jettisoned, at least in theory. Part of, you can still keep your folk dances, local foods and all that, and still, have, government employees that don't require a bribe or roving gangs. At least in theory, I think there is at some point an IQ problem here, and there is a biological reality we have to confront. But at the same time, there is an issue here where even this is, very bad for, developing countries. This can never be should never be used to justify mass immigration to
No,
Western countries, because they'll just bring the corruption here.
no,
This has happened.
David, I don't support mass immigration to Western countries. Although I believe in free trade and free labor, I'm also pragmatic. Therefore, if America decides to import immigrants, these people should be going to America for a specific reason, like to work or to study. And
Right.
I'm really serious. I'm not in the business of random immigration. So Haiti's having a crisis, and we're importing Asians. And I wrote a small letter in a Jamaican publication, basically arguing that Haiti should not become our problem. Jamaica has been assisting Haiti since the 19th century. Whenever there was a coup in Haiti, usually the deposed president would relocate to Jamaica. That's where you would serve his exile. And we have granted asylum to Asian immigrants before. But the problem in Haiti is never ending, because the Haitian revolution, it was a mistake. Nobody wants to be a slave, but you can't run a country without financial and human capital. But David, I'm going to close this link and send another link, okay?
All right. Sounds good.